It's the age-old debate, Corolla versus Civic.
These two nameplates have been duking it out since the 70s, and it's led us to these very easy to like and easy to recommend hatchbacks.
So ultimately it comes down to this: which is better overall, and which is worth your hard-earned money?
While some people will look at the new Corolla and see a massive grille, I think Toyota has done a very good job in making its compact hatchback look really attractive. I really like all of the LED designs up front, and you can finally get it in some very creative colors, like this weird olive-like gray-green. On the other hand, it doesn't have this wild two-spoiler design happening at the back of the Civic, and quite frankly, if you think this is attractive like Sebastian does, you might need to get your eyes checked. I mean, what's going on with this ginormous mustache?
Under the hood of the Corolla, we find the Dynamic Force engine. It's a naturally aspirated 2-liter engine that makes 168 horsepower and 151 pound-feet of torque. Mated to a CVT transmission, it gets 33 miles per gallon, and because it's naturally aspirated, you can get away with using regular fuel. And over here we have the 1.5-liter turbocharged Earth Dreams engine under the Civic's hood. It makes 180 horsepower and 177 pound-feet of torque. That depends on trim, which will also affect MPG, which is 32 in this sport model, but can go up to 34 depending on what you get. It comes with a CVT, and because it's got a turbocharger, you have to spring for the premium, or it's recommended.
We're here in familiar territory, and that is the Civic's cabin. And what can be said about this cabin that hasn't been said in some of the other comparisons that we've had with this Civic? The key takeaways here is that it has more rear seat space and more cargo space when compared to the Corolla, and that's very important for a compact hatchback. There's also a few other goodies you can get in this car, including rear heated seats and an upgraded 12-speaker sound system. There are some downsides to the Civic interior, particularly when it comes to this infotainment system, which is a bit clunky to use. Fortunately, it has Android Auto and Apple CarPlay support, so that helps things out a little bit. On the whole though, this interior isn't very luxurious or even premium. The interior can be kind of low rent in some places, and the cabin is full of all of these buttons.
The Corolla may not have all the cubbies and storage solutions of the Civic, but what it does have is low-key great style. The materials are kind of cheap, so it's not quite a Mazda 3, but it's got a lot of really nice touches. It's got a chrome bar up here, it's got different colors on the seats, and it looks really good. The buttons are really simple to use too, but the infotainment isn't. The infotainment system is a bit of a sticking point for both of these cars, but I would say that the Corolla's is even worse. It's really slow to use, it's hard to see what's going on when you're just glancing down at it, and because it doesn't have Android Auto, it does have Apple CarPlay finally, but it doesn't have Android Auto. So if like me, you have an Android, you're just stuck with this really bad infotainment system. Speaking of places where this is worse than the Civic, there's the back seats. There isn't a lot of room for them. So if you've got kids, they're gonna be pretty cramped. So basically, if you're an aesthete, you'll want the Corolla, but if you're a parent, you'll want the Civic.
On the road, you'll find that the Civic is much faster and much more fun to drive because of this than the Corolla. That has a lot to do with that 1.5-liter turbocharged engine, although I should point out that there have been some reliability concerns with the 1.5T in the Civic, Accord, and CR-V. So if you're buying this car expecting the usual bulletproof reliability that Honda is known for, you should go into this whole thing with your eyes open. Because of the amount of torque and power available by this engine, the car feels really good to drive. The torque is available nice and low in the rev range, and that makes this car easy to drive in the city, and you can actually initiate some passes on the highway as well. When it comes to steering feel, this car also is pretty good. It's a well-weighted steering wheel, and I wouldn't call this, a sporty hot hatch in any way, but it gets the job done. You won't feel like it's very vague, but you also won't feel like it's the liveliest thing out there. I think that this is a very good, balanced vehicle when it comes to handling, and that's something that maybe the Corolla does a little bit better. It might be a tiny bit more engaging, but I have some issues with the way you sit in that thing. It feels like you're sitting really high, and in the Civic, it feels like the car is wrapped around you nice and easily. So, you feel like you're part of the situation. If you want to drive this Civic with some enthusiasm, all you need to do is move this gear stick into that S position and you'll get more out of this drivetrain. The only problem is that the CVT can get kind of loud, and as a whole, the vehicle just doesn't sound that refined on the road. And finally, if you do want to get some kind of driving engagement with the Civic, you do have these paddle shifters, although they shift between a couple of preset gear ratios and they're not very satisfying to use at all. It's kind of a change of position for the Civic, which used to be the enthusiast's choice when it comes to compact hatchbacks, and now it just isn't the case. It's a really good all-arounder. And you can see that when it comes to some of the technology in this vehicle. There's a lot of great stuff in here, specifically the adaptive cruise control system, which I think is really good, and it brings the car down to speed when there's traffic really easily. On the other hand, when it comes to the forward collision warning system, it can get panicked and overwhelmed really easily. And you don't get a blind spot monitor in this car. Instead, you get Honda's lane watch camera, which shows you a feed of what's going on directly beside you on the passenger side of the vehicle, which actually, I think, ruins your driving habits, because then, instead of looking at the mirror, you're going to be looking at your central screen, and I'm not exactly a big proponent of that. As long as you're not putting too much emphasis in the forward collision warning system and that blind spot monitoring system, you should really enjoy what the Civic has to offer here. For $27,000 as equipped, it's hard to see what the Corolla can do that's better than the Civic.
So here we are in the Corolla that Sammy has been bashing a little bit, which I find unfair, because I really liked this car. But on paper, it doesn't look that great. It's down on power, it doesn't weigh any less, and it kind of has light steering. You wouldn't think that this would be an enthusiast car, but I think I've cracked it. I think the secret here is that what it does is it does the most with what it has. So here I want to talk about the torque curve, because the torque in this thing, because it's a naturally aspirated car, it crests at about 4,800 RPM. Now that's high for a car these days. And the thing about turbocharged cars is that you can get a whole bunch of torque way down low. The Civic peaks at about 1,500 RPM, which is right about where you're starting off. That makes it feel quick off the line, and that's a good thing for selling because a lot of people like that. The thing that this car does, though, is the torque crests at 4,800 RPM, which seems high, but it's right where you're misbehaving. If you're being sensible, chances are you're hanging out at around between 2,000 and 3,000 RPM. But if you're having a little bit of fun, and you're still trying to be respectful, chances are you're hanging around right around 4,000 to 5,000 RPM. So when you want to misbehave, it's exactly when this car comes alive. The other thing that this car has is light steering, which traditionally isn't considered a good thing, but it also has really direct steering, so it feels really quick. So right when you turn in, stuff starts happening. And the steering isn't just good because of the rack, it also has a great suspension. It's got a multi-lift suspension in the back, which kind of lets you dip a little bit. So when you're going around a corner, it makes you feel like you're miming turning, like you're going, whoa, right? And when you're a kid, that's the most fun you're having, and this kind of makes you feel just a little bit like that. It's not a hot hatch. It doesn't go that quickly, but it does have enough. And that's the other thing about on paper, is this thing has 170 horsepower, which I'll admit is 10 fewer than the Civic. But in a car that only weighs about 3,000 pounds, it's plenty, it's fine. Yeah, it gets a little buzzy on the highway, but so do most cars like this. What this thing does is it acts a bit like the Kicks, which was a cheap car, and it was cheap car fast. This is also cheap car fast, but you're surrounded by an interior that doesn't feel cheap. So it feels really special somehow. It feels like you've got the best of a cheap hatchback with a kind of premium interior. Now I'll admit that it's got some problems with space, and the Civic isn't exactly a slouch. So whereas this thing is a lot of fun to drive if you're an enthusiast, the Civic is a lot of fun to drive pretty much no matter who you are. The CVT in this thing is actually also really clever. It's got the first gear is a real gear, and then it turns into a CVT after that. And then you get 10 sort of fake mixed up gears, whatever CVT do. And that actually works out really well. I think that this is a really inoffensive transmission, feels good off the line, it feels good going around corners, and it does everything you want. And again, because it has a torque curve that's up higher, it feels smooth. When you're going around a corner and you dip into the throttle, it doesn't immediately give you a kick of torque, because that's when you'd be at about 1,500 RPM. It builds the torque smoothly. Now that, again, will feel slower to a lot of people, and I get the sense that this is going to get the complaint that it's slow. People are going to accuse this of being slow. But I don't think that that's a problem, because I think that it feels smooth, it feels good to drive, it feels easy to drive, and it feels fast when you need it to feel fast. A manual transmission would probably be better, but blah, 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 save the manuals. I'm a desperate, sad fool, so don't worry about that. Like just about every other Toyota on the road today, CHR, RAV4, Prius, yada, 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 this is on Toyota's TNG platform, which honestly feels really good. It felt really good under the RAV4, and it feels really good under this. It feels confident. Again, the body feels stiff. That does also make it feel like it's got more chassis than actual power, which means that if Toyota decided to do a TRD version, a hot hatch version, I think this would take to it really well. It's got a really great platform for it. It feels fast, and it feels like a good fun car to just dump a little more power into. So if they did want to put a turbocharger on it, that is something that they could do. Overall, this is a really fun car, and I would highly recommend it. It feels great to drive. I think it's comfortable. I think it's perfectly fuel efficient, but it doesn't have as much space in the back. So that does kind of hamper its livability. Ultimately, like the interior, it's going to come down to whether you're an aesthete, whether you care about the way the car looks, or if you're just looking for something that's practical. Both give you something, just depends on what you're looking for. The Corolla is finally in the right place. It's good to look at and it's fun to drive. It's good enough to be mentioned alongside the best in the class for reasons other than longevity and reliability.
And as good as it is, it's clear that the Civic is the better overall package, with more power, space, and efficiency. It may not be as pretty or luxurious as the Toyota, but it gets the job done, and then some.